very, very pleased to introduce Boston author JOAN LEEGANT, who will be speaking about her new book of short stories, Displaced Persons. Displaced Persons was the winner of the National New American Fiction Prize, selected out of over 500 manuscript submissions. Hadassah Magazine selected it for their One Book, One Hadassah program, which chooses 6 books a year to feature for their 200,000 readers nationwide. And the Women's League for Conservative Judaism, the national umbrella organization for sisterhoods at conservative synagogues, recently chose Displaced Persons for their Women's League Reads program, which selects just 3 books a year to highlight for their members and book clubs across the country. JOAN is the author of 2 earlier books, Wherever You Go, a novel which the Union of Reform Judaism designated as a, quote, significant Jewish book, and An Hour in Paradise, another story collection, which won the Penn New England Book Prize, the Book Award, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Formerly a lawyer, JOAN taught writing for 8 years at Harvard, as well as at other universities in Boston, Oklahoma, Seattle, and Israel. She began writing fiction at age 40. And finally, for many years, JOAN was the keyboard player in a local klezmer band. Displaced Persons will be for sale and for signing by JOAN after the talk, and it really is quite a bargain price. It is $14 and will make a wonderful read as a Hanukkah gift. I ask you now to please join me in welcoming our guest, JOAN LEEGANT.
Thank you so much, Pepe, and I know you can probably hear me pretty well in this room, and I hope everyone in Zoom is clear, so that's all good. Okay, hello. And I'm sure you figured out that we'll do a Q&A at the end, so if you have questions on Zoom, I think someone will be monitoring the chat, so you can put your questions in there. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to come down here from Boston and be able to talk in the community here and talk about my book. And what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this book. Obviously, it's a collection of short stories. Half of the stories are set in Israel, and half are set among Jewish families in the States. And so I'm going to talk a little about where those stories came from, a little bit about the writing process. And then I'm going to close, and before we have any Q&A, I'm going to close and give you a few moments to talk about the state of publishing for Jewish writers and Israeli writers. There's a climate out there that I think people would like to know about, that I feel I need to share a little bit, let people know what's happening. So for starters, as I mentioned, half of the stories in this book were set in Israel, and my other books also have a lot of Israel content. I lived in Israel for 2 sort of chunks of my life. When I was a young lawyer in the very early 80s, I went to Israel for what I thought would be 6 months, and I stayed for 3 years. I fell in love with the country, like so many of us do. I studied at a place called Machon Pardes, some of you will know it. And I reluctantly came back. I didn't want to, but life circumstances kind of required that it happen. So I was very happy when 25 years later, I was already writing fiction, and I was invited to be a visiting writer at Bar Ilan University, outside Tel Aviv. Bar Ilan has a wonderful creative writing program in their English department. So I worked there. I was a visiting writer for 5 years there. And I did 2 other things, which I mentioned because they made their way into my stories, and they also helped me have an even richer experience during those years. So when I was there, I became what is called a target of opportunity by the State Department. Sounds very nefarious. They didn't issue me any weapons, but it sounds a little nefarious. But what it turns out is that if you have a skill or a background, an aptitude, that is of interest to what the State Department or the embassy in any country you are in is of interest to them, they ask you to go out and do programming. So it turns out in Israel, they're very, very interested in English language learning, in American literature, American culture. They are interested in programs that support democracy, civil rights, because it's a very diverse and varied population with lots of issues around those very topics. So I did a lot of programming throughout the country on these very aspects. And one of the great things is that it enabled me to go to parts of the country and places I would otherwise not have visited. You know, I'm sure you know that 20% of the population of the citizens of inside Israel, not Gaza and the West Bank, but come from the Arab sector. That's Palestinian Christians, Muslims, the Druze community, these are Bedouin in the south, all kinds of people from different aspects of the Arab sector. And then, of course, there's Jews who are religious, non-religious, there are Russian Jews, there's all kinds of diversity. So I was able to visit many of these communities in the course of this programming, which was very rich. Some of that made their way into my stories as well. And I did one other thing while I was there during that period. I also was a volunteer ESL teacher for African refugees and asylum seekers. And some of you I know are nodding, you know that at that time there were 50,000 Africans who had essentially walked across the continent, you know, from places like Darfur and Eritrea and other really difficult places that were having famine and war and genocide and all kinds of political persecution. And they would walk across the continent. If they made it through Egypt alive and not taken for ransom, they would cross the border into Israel. Israel had some considerations how to handle this population, so we can talk about that during the Q&A. But in any case, I had the opportunity, after I met members of this community, to be an ESL teacher in a center in South Tel Aviv, which also gave me an opportunity to be part of another community. And again, it made its way into this collection. And in fact, the story in the book called Displaced Persons, which became the title, is actually about this community. So this was part of my experience there. I had one more experience I want to share with you, and then we'll turn to talk about the book. So I also was in Israel for 6 weeks after the war broke out. So like everybody, you know, October 7th comes and I'm watching the news constantly. A number of reasons. I was attached to Israel. I was really concerned about what was happening. I also have a son who lives there. He's in Tel Aviv, and he's a photojournalist who does a lot of work for the Times of Israel. If you read go on their website, he does a lot of their video work. So, you know, we were talking all the time. And after a number of months went by, my husband and I felt like we're just sitting on our hands. We really wanted to go volunteer. As you might know, I'm sure you do know, the area that was targeted by Hamas is the Gaza area. They call it the Gaza envelope, the communities all along the Gaza border. They're overwhelmingly agricultural. And in fact, I just learned that 70% of the vegetables, not the fruits, but the vegetables that feed the Israeli public are grown in this Gaza envelope. But those areas, the fields, the farms, the greenhouses, the orchards, they're all tended by foreign workers. And the foreign workers were very badly hurt on October 7th. And overwhelmingly in that area, there were Thai workers from Thailand. 38 Thai workers were killed on October 7th. 28 were taken hostage. Many of them died in captivity early on. And within about 2 weeks of October 7th, 1/3 of all the Thai workers in the country were airlifted out back to Thailand, understandably. So that left all this produce to kind of rot on the vine, many of you know, right? And so Israelis were coming out in droves on October 8th. The schools were closed, the universities, so professors and teachers and people from all walks of life were going to pick the produce to salvage what they could for the country. So by January or February, my husband and I were feeling like, you know, we should just go volunteer, because at that point, Americans and people from Europe were also going. So I thought, that's what we'll do. And I wrote to my friends in Israel and said, you know, we're going to come, hope to see you. And one of my colleagues from the embassy that I used to do work with wrote to me and said, if you're coming here, why don't you lead writing workshops to help Israelis cope with the stress of the war? And I said, you know, I'm not a therapist. I mean, I was a lawyer, I'm a writer, but I'm not a therapist. These are going to be trauma workshops. And she said, that's the point. Anything that we can do to help people cope, manage, process somehow the stress and the trauma would be helpful. They're really in need. Everyone, the kids, the students, their own families. 200,000 Israelis were in the reserves. They were depleting the workforce and the faculties of places. Whatever we can do to support people, let's do it. So she put out a description, and within a couple of days, 15 workshops filled. So I did 15 workshops with Israelis, and again, they came from all across the society. These were religious Jews and non-religious Jews, and Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, and people from the Druze community, everyone, because everyone was under stress, whatever their community was. So I want to share with you just one anecdote from that, because every time I go to Israel and every time I think about it, there's some other nuance and some other window into how life is being conducted there. So this particular workshop was pretty big. There were about 40 people. It was a professional development group of teachers. These were people who were experienced teachers who also taught teachers. This particular workshop was at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon at the end of a long workday. And what I would do in these workshops is provide a prompt. It would be a visual prompt, because some of them were on Zoom, along with a verbal prompt. And this particular prompt was called compassion. And so for the verbal, I put up on the screen and I read a poem. It's very short, it's about 6 lines. The poet is Miller Williams, American poet, and it's called Compassion. And the visual prompt, I should say, was a photograph of hands holding like little seeds and buds. And I said, here's the prompt, so here's the poem, and it starts like this: have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. And then it has a few more lines, and the last 2 lines are, you do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone. Meaning, have compassion for everyone. You don't know what people are carrying, right? And I said to them, here's the poem, here's the visual, here's the question: who in your life could use compassion right now? And I said, write for 5 minutes. You don't have to share it with anyone, just write. Whatever comes up, let it come up. So after the 5 minutes, I said, anybody want to share? This woman raises her hand. She said, I don't usually talk about myself, but I can't believe what I wrote. She said, so she read her description. Her day was, she got up in the morning, she went out to teach a full day of high school English. This was her job. At the end of the school day, she rushes out to pick up her own kids, deposit them at home, give them something to eat, stops in to visit her aging, ailing mother, then goes off to the local teachers' college to teach a class of teachers in training. And in between, she had gone to 2 shivas and a funeral. And she said, this is my day all the time. I mean, not every day, but all week long. And she said, I walk around constantly thinking that I'm not measuring up, and yet I have to measure up. Not measuring up, I feel like I have to. And everyone in the room nodded. They were all experiencing the same thing, whether they were religious Jews or they were Christian Arabs. Everyone was feeling that whatever they had to handle, they couldn't do it, and that they had to. And then she said, what surprised her in writing this is that she realized that the person that she most had to have some compassion for was herself. And this was not a woman who put herself first, but she said it was so helpful. She said, nothing changed in the outside world. And this was back in last March. Nothing still has changed. The funerals are going on, the war is going on. Nothing changed, but it helped her to recognize this is what she was feeling, to have validation from others, to be able to share it with others, and then to have the fortitude to just keep going. So I share this partly to say that, first of all, if you have opportunities to go to Israel and you have something to share, or even if you don't, you just want to go and be there and spend money in restaurants, that will also help people, help their morale. And also to say that everyone is, you get these windows into how people are managing on the macro level and the micro level. So that's a little about that experience. So I'm going to segue now to talk a little bit about this book. So here's the book. And I say half of the stories are set in Israel, half are set in the States. It's short stories. My first book was a collection of short stories too. And they were written over a long period of time. I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write a book of short stories. I wrote them over a period. while I was also working on some novels. And people sometimes wonder, what's the difference besides length? What's the difference between writing the two? I heard another writer say it the best way I've ever heard. He said, writing a novel is like a long-term commitment. You stay with it, you're committed. It's like a marriage. You have to stay committed. Writing a short story is like having a little affair. You give yourself a little, kind of a little quick satisfaction and immediate gratification, and then you go back to the long haul. So I kind of like to think that because I was working on the short stories as I was writing the novels. I have to put the novels aside from time to time to let them kind of marinate in a drawer before I could bring them out again. So I was writing these stories over a long period. And the other thing is, short stories take a while to write. And people wonder, what's the deal? I mean, it's 15 pages. How long could this be to take, how to write? Why does it take so long? And in fact, I'm reminded of, with my first book, which was also stories, I was once in a public library talking about the book, and there was a kid in the room. A 15-year-old, 16-year-old boy raises his hand. He says, how long did it take you to write the stories? In this book, there were 10 in that book. I said, I wrote them over about a 5 or 6 year period. And he said, you must be a really slow typist. And I have never forgotten that because he thought, this is an act of transcription. You got the story in your head, you type it all out, you pull out a thesaurus, you get some longer words, you throw in some metaphors and some nice images, you change a semicolon to a comma, and then gamarnu, you're done. This is the story, he assumed. That's how you write. Of course, that is not generally how it works. Anyone who does any kind of art form knows, or any really kind of work, this really is not just an act of transcription. It doesn't come straight out of your head like that. I like to quote, actually, E.L. Doctorow, who I learned grew up in New Rochelle, New York, not too far, or made his home there for a long time. He said, writing a novel is like driving your car at night in the fog. You can see only as far as your headlamps, but you can make the whole trip that way. You're kind of groping your way. You don't know the whole story, but you do your best just to keep following along and following along. And when I teach, I would often say to students, look, I have two heads. You look at me, you say, well, I only see one. So I've got the lawyer head. I was a lawyer, and the lawyer head's very organized and outlines things. And then there's this other head, the one that kind of tells the stories. They don't communicate very well. And I can't get to that other head by thinking the way I would get to the lawyer head. I can't think my way there. I have to find workarounds through associations and mostly through the actual act of writing itself. And I've heard other artists talk about this. They get their information from the canvas. The canvas tells them what to do, or the piece of marble or whatever it might be. So similarly, I wait until the words on the page kind of tell me what to do. And it's a nerve-wracking way to work. You don't know where you're going for a long time. You have to operate in the dark. There's a couple of occupational hazards when you work this way without a map. One of them is called Scotch. The other one's called M&Ms. I mean, you just have to kind of keep plodding your way, But the rewards at the end are really great, in my view. And I like to think of Robert Frost has a great line. He has two great lines. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And then he also says, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. It's like, if you're not moved, if you're not getting some discovery yourself, the reader is going to feel that. It's a little bit going to be paint, at least for someone like me, a little paint by numbers. It doesn't work. So how do you get anything written if you don't have a plan, if you don't know what it's going to be, if you can't think your way to the story and through the story? So I wanted to tell you about 3 ways that some of the stories here got written, and I'll read you some excerpts, and then I'll close with my other comments. We're happy to have a Q&A. So the first way that I write a lot of my stories sounds very self-evident, but here it goes. I literally write, I do it by hand, I write a first sentence. I don't know where that sentence comes from. I put my intentions aside. I have to put any ideas aside. I sit down and see, what is that? And is there something in that first sentence that's begging for another sentence? Often I hear the second sentence right on the tail of the first one, and I just follow it, not worrying about where it's going to go, just follow the sentences and see where they take you. Because invariably, they take me to places I would not have expected to go if I didn't follow the words. So I'm going to give you an example from the book. And this first sentence survived all the revisions, I was going to say renovations, but all the revisions to the manuscript. And it was the first sentence I wrote originally, and it retained. So here it is. The story is called Beautiful Souls. And it goes like this. They were two American girls, Abby and Jennifer, best friends, 16, and not entirely naive, wandering in the Arab Shuk in Jerusalem's old city. Well, when I wrote that first sentence, I patted myself in the back. I said, great first sentence. Why is that first sentence so great for a writer? Well, first of all, these girls came with their names, like sandwich boards. Abby and Jennifer, they announced themselves right off the bat. People think writers give their characters names, and sometimes you have to, but you're lucky if they come with their names, because then you can start to get a feel for who they might be, as if the story kind of lives out there in the ether, and your job is to sort of bring it into focus. Because within about a page, I discovered, where did these girls come from? Cambridge, Massachusetts. So already I was beginning to think, all right, Abby and Jennifer from Cambridge. Now, 16-year-old Jewish girls, I already had a sense that they were there with their parents. Who's raising their kids in Cambridge? They're not in the suburbs, like where I live, Newton. You know, they're not in the suburbs. They're not way out in the country. They're choosing to raise their kids in the city, starting to get a little feel for who the family might be, what might be behind these girls. So that was one part. So that's number one. Another great thing in the sentence is, where are they? The sentence told me, it said they are wandering. I didn't write sightseeing or shopping. They were wandering in the Arab Shuk in Jerusalem's old city. So some of you may have been in a shuk, an outdoor market, whether it's the Arab Shuk or Machne Yehuda, some other shuk. The shuk is an interesting place, right? You know, alleyways, smells, spice vendors, sounds, interesting stuff. And the other thing is, as I said, I wrote these over a long period. I wrote this book not too long after the Second Intifada. And in the Second Intifada, there were bombings, bus bombings, and shuk bombings, you know, almost every day. Jerusalem was tense. It's still tense, but it was really tense then. So they're in this tense place where something's going to happen. These two girls wandering alone in the shuk. Something's a little tense. And the third and even biggest gift of that sentence that came, two girls, Abby and Jennifer, best friends, 16, and not entirely naive. And when I wrote that, I think somewhere in the back of my brain, I'm thinking, oh, really? Like, I thought the story was going to be about these two girls saying to their parents, oh, we're 16, we're not naive, we can wander by ourselves in the shuk. And in fact, that is what happened in the story. Something happens like that. But it also turned out that I did not know this, but the story ended up actually being about the naivete of Americans in Israel. And if you had asked me, did I think I was going to write about that? Did I even have that attitude? I don't think I would have said yes. I don't know. But it came later in the story, and here's how it came about. Writing the story, writing along, something does happen, and later in the story, two soldiers encounter these girls because something has happened. Now, how old are soldiers in Israel? These are young soldiers. They're not much older than these girls. They're like 18 maybe. And they encounter them, and one of them says to the girls, he says, this is not a Disney theme park. And when I wrote that, I was taken aback, and I thought, well, how are we? Do we take places, we take pictures, it's cobblestone streets, we think it's exotic. The soldier says, this is not a Disney theme park. And then he really delivered the punch, which gave the story the title. The soldier says to them, you know what is a Yafeh Nefesh? You know what, anyone here, the translation of Yafeh Nefesh? Beautiful soul, Yafeh Nefesh. And it's an idiom in English. Anybody know what the idiom is? I didn't know, I had to learn, but the soldier tells them. The soldier says, you know what is a Yafeh Nefesh? Beautiful soul. In English, you say bleeding heart. And then he says, you can be that way in America, but we can't be that way here. And I remember writing it and thinking, the soldier says it. I'm like kind of transcribing, but it delivered to me a message that helped me understand the mentality of Israelis. Like, you can afford to be soft in America. And it also helped me understand the Israelis might want to be that way. They might like not to have to be so tough, but you can't afford to be such a Yafeh Nefesh. And I wrote this story, I do have to tell you, this is, 12 years before October 7th. I mean, this is also was interesting to revisit it now in this book, which was accepted for publication long before October 7th, but came out after October 7th when I had to look at the stories from that perspective. So it helped me understand. How did I get there, though? I got there by that first sentence, just following sentence by sentence, hanging in there, and the soldiers appear, and they speak, and they delivered the story. Now, of course, I know there are writers in the room, and everyone also knows, for every story that seems to work out so great this way, there's about 20 that don't go anywhere, and the sentences fizzle out. But if you're lucky, you follow the sentences, and it takes you to a deeper place. So that's method one. Write a sentence and see where it takes you. A second way that one of the stories in this book got written happened to me once in my life, never happened again. I was commissioned, and I have to tell you, fiction writers do not get commissions to write short stories. Painters might, and composers might get a commission. But NPR has a very interesting show called Hanukkah Lights. It's been around for 35 years. And they solicit stories from writers. So a number of years ago, I got an email from someone at NPR, said, would you write a story for our Hanukkah show? The only criteria is it has to have Hanukkah in there. So far be it from me to turn down an offer like that, and I wrote several. One of them is in this book. I sent NPR a different one that was a little shorter, I thought would work better on the radio. But I'm going to read you the opening of this one. It's a very different tone from the other one, and you'll hear the Hanukkah reference right at the beginning. So it goes like this. It's called Roots. Hirschman, unwilling to bend, was refusing to participate. A lifelong agnostic and proud of it, he'd managed for 82 years to not observe a single of his people's canonical festivals except in its breach, and he had no intention of starting now. It was his father's way before him, and his father's father's, and now it was his. He ate bread on Passover, went to the track on Yom Kippur, and since childhood had miraculously avoided the trappings of this one, the relentlessly marketed Jewish Christmas, when boys and girls with names like Cohen and Levy were commanded to ignore the country's love affair with eggnog and fruitcake in favor of oily potato dishes invented by starving peasants in Galicia. Not that the so-called historical origins of the holiday were any better, Hirschman liked to remind himself. The ancient Maccabees, a posse of religious fanatics who killed any fellow Jew who didn't agree with them, and their visions of a theocracy that to Hirschman's lights wasn't all that different from the Taliban's or an Ayatollah's Iran. But now, Hirschman's octogenarian resolve was being shaken at its root like a flimsy pine grasped around the trunk by a gorilla, threatened to be loosened of its footings by the least likely person on the planet, his daughter. The daughter! Need Hirschman even think about all that he and his long-dead wife had endured because of Wendy? A list, a mile long, and everything a man of his years had once read about on screaming covers of Time. Drugs, abortions, political arrests, the FBI knocking on their door, serial boyfriends, some apparently, if briefly, quasi-spousal. A list so predictable that decades back, Hirschman stopped looking to the telephone for news of Wendy's life and simply bought the magazines. And now this daughter was turning 50, almost as old as Hirschman, and trying for respectable, with a regular job and ladies' suits and a six-month-old marriage to an actual husband, a long-faced man named Ronald who drove a Ford. A daughter who was now entreating Hirschman to come over and light Hanukkah candles with Ronald's even longer-faced 13-year-old son, where Hirschman could, in Wendy's submissive pleading, rediscover his roots. Roots, Hirschman declaimed from the extension in the bedroom where he'd been soaking his feet in Epsom salts. Of all his bodily parts, Hirschman's feet were hands down his least attractive. Marilyn used to say they were satanic, with sharp yellow nails that curled under and toes bonily misshapen like the beckoning fingers of a fairy tale witch. Hirschman had come to view his feet as a separate part of his being, the workhorses of his body, the sad, ugly oxen pulling the plow. What roots, he said, splashing in the chipped plastic dishbin he'd rescued from his neighbor's trash. They were thieves, my ancestors, crooks. They stole from their business partners and screwed their customers. They came here from Russia, like the British went to Australia as ex-cons fleeing. What do you think? Everyone had a father like Bashevis Singer with his saintly rabbinical court, Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. So that was Hirschman. I know. You can imagine how much fun it was to write this story, right? And I have written dark stories, and it was a real pleasure to write something that was funny. But one of the things that was a great gift to me as a writer is Hirschman arrived in sentence one fully formed, like the girls with their names. Hirschman says, Hirschman, unwilling to bend, was refusing to participate. This guy announced himself right away. And if you're willing to go with that and unplug and not worrying about being correct or whatever, it was great fun to write a guy like this. He's really an ornery character. And ultimately, he actually forms a bond with this 13-year-old step-grandson who turns out to have an interest in Jewish lowlifes and criminals. So the two of them bond over their interest in criminals. It's great fun to write. And somebody asked me, so what's the deal with the feet? You know, why do you have him soaking his feet in Epsom salts? And part of it is when you're writing a scene, you know, Hirschman was on the phone. I mean, imagine he's on the phone. So often you situate your character. They're in the kitchen. You might have them turn off the tea kettle, or maybe they're, you know, I don't know, rinsing out their glasses or whatever. The character sometimes has to do something in the scene. I had him soaking his feet in Epsom salts because it was funny. It struck me as funny, and it was already in the tone of this guy. And as long as I had him soaking his feet, I figured I might as well describe the feet. But part of the description also fits his character, is that, you know, you use everything you can to convey what kind of guy he is. So I gave him these satanic nails. Plus, it turned out that his feet, and soaking his feet, turned out to turn out later in the story, because Wendy, the daughter, he has to go pick her up somewhere, and he has to go out, and he looks at his shoes, and he calls them, he waits by the closet and says, my shoes, those cruel prisons. He has to put his feet in the shoes. So I tell students, don't dismiss anything that you put in the beginning. You never know how it may turn up later to help, you know, amplify your story. So that was Hirschman. That was a lot of fun to write. And so the third and final method, so to speak, of one of the stories here came out. This is a story that I never wanted to write, and I almost felt kind of like I had to. It was almost like I felt forced to write. So one of the things I did when I was teaching in Israel at the university, I also taught privately. I have a friend who had a private writing studio where people could come and write in English. He was a person originally from America, and he would run these classes, and sometimes I would go and teach for him, like an all-day class, something related to writing prose, fiction, nonfiction, whatever. And we would do prompts like the one I described about the compassion, and we would read material, talk about it, and then, you know, have a prompt, and people would write. And these would go on literally from like 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. So in these classes, I would set kind of one rule. I'd say to the students, the participants, who were usually sitting around tables with coffee and snacks and this type of thing, I would say during the writing session, they would usually be like 15 minutes, sometimes a little longer, but during the writing session, I'd say stay at the table and just write. Let whatever comes up, come up. But this is not the time to decide you must get up and have your 9th cup of coffee, or you must go out and have a smoke. Like, stay at the table, because sometimes something will come up that you might be resisting otherwise, and just, you don't have to share it with anyone, just stay at the table and let it come up. And the second thing I would do is I would stay at the table too, because I wanted to model that we're all in the same boat. We're all looking at the blank page. I might be further along in the craft or the publishing, but, you know, I'm also looking at the blank page. So I also had to stay at the table. And in one particular class, I remember it was the afternoon. It had taken me an hour to get there on 2 buses from my apartment in Tel Aviv to the studio in Netanya. It was a long schlep. I was tired. The last thing I wanted to do during one of these writing sessions was stay at the table and write. I wanted to go out and get my 9th cup of coffee, but I couldn't very well start getting that or scrolling my phone. I had to do something. So I told myself, find something. And I used to take a very unusual bus, a public bus, but from my apartment to the university. It was decorated very unusually. About every other time that I went there, that was the bus I got. And in Israel, the drivers tend to have kind of their own bus. You know, they don't own it, but they take that bus home. And so this one was decorated by this driver in an unusual way. I thought, okay, I'll write something about the bus. Maybe something will come up. Something did come up. The story had some other ambitions for me. So I'm going to read to you from it and then tell you what happened. So it's called Bus. I waited for the bus at the stop I was told to use by the people I was supposed to meet at the university. We were going to talk about a paper I'd written decades before when I lived in California, The department had heard I was visiting Israel and wanted to meet. I wasn't interested in the paper anymore, but I didn't want to be rude, plus I had time on my hands. But when I got to the stop, I was afraid it wasn't the right line, afraid I'd misunderstood their accented English, or written the number down incorrectly, or had the wrong street. This happened often. I worried about getting lost, or arriving late, or ending up in a strange neighborhood and not being able to find my way back to wherever I'd come from. So that morning, I decided I would work up my courage and ask the driver, no matter how impatient he seemed, if this was the right line. I practiced words while I waited in the shelter, trying not to attract the attention of the other women standing there with their plastic bags of groceries. But when I climbed up the metal stairs and heard the whoosh of the doors closing and felt the bus lurching down the tree-lined boulevard, I forgot all about asking the driver. All around me were stuffed animals, plush brown teddy bears and monkeys with curly tails and baby kangaroos in their mothers' pouches, turtles and lions and soft yellow ducks. They were strapped to the poles and tied to the overhead hangers and swinging from the ceiling on fishing line. A pink and blue snake was threaded through the grab bars between the first 3 rows of seats, linking them together like a pillowy chain. And I stopped worrying about my appointment and the university and the bus line, and I thought about the last time my son got an infusion. So I wrote that story. I have a son who had cancer. Thankfully, he's the son in Tel Aviv, and he's okay. But I wrote the story about a year after his treatment was over, and I have to say, I did not want to write about his cancer. I didn't want to write, I don't know whether I didn't want to exploit his experience. I didn't want to write about what it was like to be there, you know, going through treatment with him. But it seems that that other part of my brain that heard the message to the other people, stay there, let whatever come up, was responding, needed some permission to say, let this come up. And part of it, I think, this is the shortest story I've ever written, and it's the most autobiographical, not an accident that it would be the shortest. But I think this feeling was, look, this is only a 15-minute exercise. I don't have to write a whole novel and live with this for 4 or 5 years or whatever. I can just explore this material a little bit. And in fact, this was about a 15-minute writing session. I wrote the whole story in those 15 minutes. It was a short, very short piece, but it needed clearly to come up, and it needed the space that I had told everyone else. So one of the things I think about in looking back at this piece, because it is autobiographical, and I tend not to write directly out of my own life, is that there are 2 things that were true in this story. This bus really does exist, did exist. In fact, over the summer, I gave a talk on Cape Cod at the Wellfleet Library, and 2 Israelis came. They had a friend in Wellfleet who saw the poster, said, oh, you know, this Jewish writer with Israel stuff. They came, and I was reading this story, and at the beginning of reading it, I saw one of the Israelis took out her phone. I thought, okay, she's bored, she's scrolling her phone. She came over to me afterwards and said, look, it's the bus. she had looked it up while I was reading it. So this bus, it was really true. This bus exists, and people know about it. So that part was true, and my son's cancer was true. But what wasn't real from real life was any connection between the 2. And that the narrator would at one point then, while she's getting on the bus, seeing all this, then say, I thought about my son. It was not from real life. And I did not know why, as it was writing, why that her brain went there. But I went with it because that's how I've learned to follow the sentences. And by the end of the story itself brought it all together for me. If you read the story, you'll see by the end, the story came full circle and made the connection for me between the stuffed animals and the woman recalling her son. But it wasn't in the real life. So it helps me understand that you're dealing in part with facts from your life, and then there's the art or the fiction or the sort of magic in a way that helps bring a story together to make it a story of a piece of kind of artistic expression rather than straight out of a real life experience. So that's a little window. There was a little postscript on that story. I sent it to a magazine called the Bellevue Literary Review. If it sounds like Bellevue Hospital, it's that it is. They have a magazine that publishes work about illness and so forth. And they published it. They very nicely, they awarded it a prize. And a year later, I was back in Israel. I'm back at the university, and sure enough, get on the bus, it's the same bus. I said to the driver, so I wrote a story about your bus. He said, no one's ever written a story about my bus. I asked him if he wanted a copy. He said, yes, my English isn't so good, but my daughter will translate it for me, and I gave him the story. So that's a little window into the process, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. I just want to close with a couple of comments to tell you a little about what has been happening for writers, Jewish writers and Israeli writers in the publishing world. Some of you are nodding. I think you probably know about this. Really, after October 7th, just like in universities, there were many forums in which there was a lot of public expression of either anti-Israel sentiment or other things along these lines, and it manifested pretty early in the publishing world. The National Book Awards, which took place in November, 5 weeks after October 7th, word was swirling around that the finalists for the National Book Award were going to make a public statement on the stage condemning Israel, and there was some concern about what that would be. I listened to it, not live, but afterwards. It wasn't that bad. They made a mention of at least the hostages, and I thought, okay, maybe this won't be so bad. Unfortunately, things kind of spiraled after that, and you may have been reading in the newspapers, you know, writers were having their work retracted. There was a wonderful essay written by a person who wrote a beautiful essay about attempting to sustain empathy. She used to drive for an organization that would meet Palestinian families at the borders to take their children to Israeli hospitals for medical treatment, called Road to Recovery. A wonderful writer wrote a beautiful essay about her desire and attempts to sustain relationships. She had colleagues. She was also a journalist. She had colleagues in Gaza. And it was accepted for publication in this very prestigious literary journal. And then before it was supposed to come out, half their editors resigned, and they said, because we will not have a Zionist apologist on our pages, in our pages. So that was her work was retracted. And this began happening to other writers. Writers were invited to bookstores, and then their invitations were retracted. A couple of them you've read about. Joshua Leifer, who wrote a book, right, about future of Jewish life. The bookstore said, it was his launch. He was about to walk into this bookstore in New York City, and his family, friends were all on the sidewalk. And on the way, his publicist called and said, problem at the bookstore. He was going to be interviewed by a guy named Andy Bachman, a Reform rabbi, both of whom he himself and the rabbi identify themselves as very far left progressives, in fact, right? And they were going to go to the bookstore, and it's closed. The sign says canceled. The bookstore employee opens the door, says, we do not want a Zionist on our premises, and then goes further and points to the writer, says, you can come, but then points to the rabbi and says, but you can't. I mean, it was one thing after another. So these kinds of things have been happening. There have been lists circulating around of various writers. Is your fave author a Zionist? One of them appeared on the list. Gabrielle Zevin, very well-respected writer. Mother is Korean, father is Jewish. She has never made her opinions of Israel public. It's not her book. Her most recent book is about people who invent video games. She landed on the list. Why? Because she gave a talk at a Hadassah group. And then she was blacklisted from a bookstore after that. Another one is a panel that got canceled by, some people who said we won't sit on a panel. The moderator, they were going to have a panel on teenage girl coming of age stories, nothing to do with anything Israel or Jewish. And two of the panelists said, we won't let this moderator, who is Jewish and outspoken pro-Israel person, we won't sit on a panel with her. So they canceled the panel instead of holding it and telling those people. And the worst one, or at least the most recent bad one, I should say, is at the very end of October, a letter was circulated around. It was spearheaded by the Irish writer Sally Rooney, and with many other famous writers, right, it's familiar to you, Jean-Paul Lahiri, many other famous literary writers, put out a letter demanding a boycott on the entire Israeli publishing industry. Everyone, whether you're published by them or publisher, an agent, a festival, anybody associated with the Israeli publishing industry should be boycotted. They had 1,000 signatures on day one. They had 5,000 on the day 4. I don't know what they're up to now. And one of the worst aspects of this boycott was it wasn't merely like, you know, until the government does something. It didn't say like until there's government action, like until they have a ceasefire, or until they leave Gaza, or it didn't even say until Netanyahu resigns or anything like that. It said the only way out of this boycott is that you must publicly disavow and what's the word? Yeah, renounce. You have to renounce your own country. I always forget the word. I think I'm blocking it out. You must denounce and renounce your own country. And therefore, you have to say, I'm not a Zionist. I'm Israeli, but I denounce my country. And that, of course, has spilled over for American Jewish writers too, because the expectation is you also must renounce. Zionism is now, being a Zionist is an epithet, and you have to renounce your attachment. And this is a very troubling and, in my view, dangerous problem, because it's not, you know, this should worry everybody about every, you know, every national group. It means we don't want to hear from you. And of course, people who have been resisting or writing about this, there was an editorial in the Times, have said, you're boycotting writers? I mean, these are the people who want to communicate, who want to talk about different cultures. I mean, boycotting anyone is not good. But they actually said their hope is that it will be the biggest cultural boycott of Israel in history. That's their goal. So it has had a chilling effect, obviously, on Jewish writers. I have, anecdotally, I'm on Facebook groups, I hear from other people being told their agents say, I can't sell a Jewish book right now. People are not getting invitations. People are getting their work put on ice or retracted. They're not being invited to festivals. I was not. I mean, I changed my strategy altogether, to not even bother. I have a friend who said, somebody told her, it's not worth it to us for you to come here, because either we have to hire a lot of security or no one will come, or we're not anti-Semitic, but, you know, no one will come. It's too much of a headache. So this is the problem, is that for people coming out with Jewish and especially Israel-based books right now are facing a lot of difficulty. So people have asked, you know, what can be done in response to this? And there, you know, there have been some editorials. There was a letter to protest this boycott. But I think a couple of things I just want to offer is, one is, first of all, it's wonderful when the Jewish community is stepping up. Hadassah has, and the Jewish Book Council and others. It's wonderful when Jewish communities like this, I want to thank Pepe and the other people here, to invite writers to come and, you know, be able to talk about their books, because people are not getting invitations to festivals and bookstores and conferences and this kind of thing. So it's really great when people invite Jewish writers to their venues. I also spoke with someone in a book group. It's a synagogue book group. She said, we read all kinds of books. Maybe this year we'll just get Jewish writers instead of everyone else. You know, we'd like to encourage people to read Jewish books, read the works of Jewish writers, to buy their books, to go to the libraries and request them, not because the libraries are anti-Semitic, they just may not know about them, to just help that. There have been individuals who've been what they call review bombed. You know, they'd get like 1-star reviews, a couple of big name writers that, you know, I mean, popular writers that have been hundreds of 1-star reviews to tank them. And so people say, you know, put a review up, a positive review, to avoid that, to encourage other people to read the books, you know, to support it, and to buy the books of Jewish writers and give them gifts and whatever, just to support the community, because people are genuinely feeling it. I don't mean in the pocketbook so much, just this idea of this, you know, this negativity out there. So I'm hopeful that, you know, people are going to keep writing. It's not going to stop people from writing, but it's a worrisome climate in the country at the moment. So hopefully it will change at some point, but this is unfortunately where we are right now. So I'm going to close there, and I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know how you want to handle the questions, Pepe, from those. Yeah. Yeah. Right, right. And if I don't know if the Zoom people are putting them, someone's monitoring.
You have one question, but I can give it to you now.
Okay.
Do you find that humor is an important part of your stories? Were you surprised that humor came so easily to you when you are writing? This is your improvement.
That's a great question. I love writing humorous stuff because I also write dark stuff. So I like to be able to do both. And I wasn't totally surprised because I've occasionally, I write Purim spiels, I write other funny stuff, but I'm always very happy to have an opportunity to write something funny. But writing funny is a little hard, you have to take a risk because not everybody's going to find what you think is funny. They're not going to find it funny, but you got to give it a try like everything else. So yeah, thank you. I like writing funny stuff.
Yes. General question, as a author, and I consider you an artist, do you find that you're more creative, productive at a certain time of the day or week than others? And then a second one, you speak so well in your inflections, have you ever considered putting your works on audiobooks?
Okay, thank you. So I would ask I'm not going to let my husband answer the first question, but, oh, repeat the question, right. So the question was, do I write at a particular time of day or kind of that type of thing? And the second is, since I like to speak, have I considered making an audiobook? So I have a very unusual, I'm an extreme night owl, and I had tried for years to write during the day. I started to write, like I said, when I was 40, you heard, I had small children, and I am a night person, and when I had regular jobs, I would have to go to sleep and somehow make myself wake up and go to work. But when I was writing a lot, my peak times, I would start at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and work till 5 a.m. I have a saint for a husband. He would take our kids, he would get them up in the morning, take them to school. And for years, I would try not to do that. When they went to school, in fact, I thought, great, they're going to school. I can go at 8:30, and then my brain would be cauliflower until 10 o'clock at night. So I've learned that I have to kind of go. I can occasionally write in the afternoon now. If I'm highly conditioned, I have to go to like an isolation chamber, but the equivalent of that. So I do have a kind of follow my rhythm like that. So that's an odd way, but it works for me. I do like to speak, and I don't have an audiobook of this, but recently someone asked me the same question, and I'm kind of trying to see if I can figure out how to make that work. It's a bit of a technical thing, you need the right sound engineering and all of that. So.
It's always nice when an author reads their own work.
Oh, I know, especially if they like to read. So, yeah, so I've talked to the publisher about it. It's a small press, so they have limited ability to make all these different types of variations, but thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
The first one is, when you're done, really done with the story, do you feel a need to go back and tie up loose ends, characters, plot lines, things that just left hanging?
When I'm done with the story?
Yeah, then do you feel a need to go back and tie up loose ends?
Okay, so that means I'm not done.
You want to repeat that question?
Oh, sorry, I should repeat the question. So the question was, when I'm done with the story, do I feel the need to go back and tie up loose ends and resolve things with the characters and so forth? So my first answer, and I don't mean to be flip, is just that then means I'm not done, because if there's a lot of loose ends or that are bothersome, then I need to do something with them. But that's not to say that every story gets tied up with a bow. And I have been occasionally, people have said, especially, with a short story, you're illuminating a limited amount of time, because sometimes people say, oh, I became so interested in this character. What happened to them next week or whatever? And I usually have to say, well, I'm not interested in next week. I only wanted to illuminate what happened right now. But if I feel like there's too much left over, it means it isn't quite done yet. So.
And this is a different question, but it's sort of a
Yeah.
mirror image. Do you find it difficult to find the right ending to a story? And if so, what do you do to find a satisfying ending?
Right, that's a good question. So the question is, do I find it difficult to find the right ending, and what do I do to find it? So over the years of teaching and learning for myself as well, invariably the problem people have with the ending is not the ending, it's the middle. Because you don't have the right middle. It's that you need, the middle will tell you the right ending. So it's not that you have the bad ending, you've gone in a slightly wrong direction to get to that ending. You often have to look back further in your story to see why I can't find the end. You probably took a detour, or more likely, in my opinion, you were engineering it, you were over-engineering it. You wanted it to go here, and it went there, and you're afraid to follow it because you don't know where that is, hence the scotch and the M&Ms. But in any case, very often the problem is the penultimate part. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, why did I give up my legal career for writing? Anybody a lawyer in the room? Just usually, anyone want to admit to that? Yeah. So, two things about that. I didn't entirely give it up in that sense. I have occasionally done part-time pieces of it. I don't even want to describe it. It's really boring tax stuff. But anyway, I have occasionally done that. But I was always writing as a kid, and I got to the point where there were a couple of practical things. I had a very supportive spouse who said, oh, okay, you want to stop being a lawyer and just, become this unemployable writer, So I had support in my household that said, you can change to do this kind of work. And I think part of it was turning 40, and I felt like I had this other urge and interest. That said, it took me a while, though. It took me a long time before I published anything. My first book was published when I was 53. So it took a long time to actually amass enough good work to make a book. So I just had this desire and need. I'd reached a certain age where I felt that I could do it, and I had the support. Yeah.
Any other questions?
In the room, right.
I have actually more of a comment.
Sure.
Which is about about the difficulty for Jewish writers and Israeli writers. And it just made me think that beginning of my career in social worker, and I worked in New York at the Israel Medical Center, and I also have a cousin that lives in Connecticut, and the family belonged to a Jewish couple. And New York Beth Israel started as a medical center to educate Jewish doctors because they can get residencies if you get into medical school. So my thinking is like, okay, this is really difficult time for writers, Jewish writers, and it's almost like we need to kind of go back to that in a sense, like you got to take care of our own.
Right. Did everybody hear that? Do I need to Do you want me to repeat? Well, the comment was a recollection here that just like when you said a hospital that was formed to help Jewish doctors, because doctors were not admitted to either medical school or these programs, that your sense was that Jewish writers we all have to help each other, and Jews need to step up. And in fact, it's a good way to kind of conclude, there have been a lot of initiatives by fellow Jewish writers to start some new publishing opportunities and some new literary journals to help reinforce and improve give people opportunities. So there's that people have responded that way. It's a good way to conclude. Okay, so thank you very much, and I think we can end here. Thank you. So.
On behalf of everyone who's here and the almost 60 people who are on Zoom, I want to thank you very, very much for this wonderful evening and for coming to Morristown and to our synagogue, and how delighted we are. And I look forward to reading more of your things in the near future. So if you want to, you can go outside, and Alan will be very happy to help you, and Joan will be signing your books. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's just wonderful.